I'm super excited about today's video because I'm going to be talking about something in terms of things that I really enjoy. Very specifically, this game. We're going to get into it. This is going to be a non-spoiler review. Just telling you ahead of time, I'm actually planning on filming two videos in general in terms of things about this. First is going to be the non-spoilery video, and then second is going to be the spoilery video, and then Final Fantasy related content is also coming to the channel in terms of bookish stuff, so you can look forward to that. Hi everyone, my name is Rose, also known as TA Summers. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be a little bit of a different video for this particular channel because I think this is the first time that I have done a formal game review on the channel. And you might be wondering, you're a booktube channel, like why are you reviewing games? Well, I talked about it in several videos before in terms of things. I'm definitely a gamer. I love consuming stories in different mediums in terms of things, including games. So this is very timely considering the chatter, the anticipation of this respective release, and also everyone whom I know seems to be playing this right now. But I'm going to be giving a non-spoiler review of Final Fantasy XVI, and you may wonder, okay, so this is a different cover than what I've seen of it online, but this has actually a reversible cover. I actually like this particular cover a little bit better than the original. I'll pop the original one up for your reference here. I took a picture of it on the channel and shared it before when I first picked up the game. But yeah, I am super excited to be able to talk about this. So I originally planned for this to be a much longer video in terms of talking about my history with Final Fantasy, being a longtime gamer, a longtime fan of Final Fantasy as well in terms of things. But I realized that could easily put this video to be quite lengthy in terms of things. So what I'm going to do is I'm probably just going to break that up into other things related to Final Fantasy and other bookish and like book tags related to Final Fantasy that I'm planning on completing for the channel. So that'll be coming, but this particular video is going to focus on my final thoughts for Final Fantasy XVI. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. First things first, I will absolutely admit that Final Fantasy XVI is the game that made me go out and finally buy a PS5. And when I tell you it was absolutely worth it, I will say it was absolutely worth it, at least for me in terms of things. I have been a long time Final Fantasy fan. Like you can kind of even see some of the background games that I have back here. I talked about in my previous videos, like showcasing my collector's edition of Dissidia Final Fantasy. And I don't know if you can see it in the angle here, but I also have the collector's edition of the Zodiac version of Final Fantasy XII, which I never had the opportunity to play way back when I played the original Final Fantasy XII, and eventually ended up picking up the Steelbook, which I think, hang on, let me get it really quickly. Here we go. So this is my copy of Final Fantasy XII, the Zodiac Age in Steelbook, and you can see the back of it here. But I have played multiple Final Fantasy games for many years. My very first one was Final Fantasy VII, and that I can go a little bit in more detail about that experience in another video. But I had been anticipating picking up Final Fantasy XVI for quite some time in terms of the chatter about it, but I think what really sold me on the game was actually being able to experience the demo. I definitely think that if you are kind of on the fence about whether Final Fantasy XVI is an experience for you in terms of things, definitely either pick up the, like if you have a PS5, definitely play the demo and see if it's right for you, or watch a playthrough of it in terms of things. I had to actually watch a playthrough of the demo to determine it in terms of things, because I wasn't sure. Like I really am willing to make this investment, as even with being a Final Fantasy fan. And when I saw the playthrough of the demo, that was what cemented my decision to be able to buy the game. So to kind of get into specifics in terms of what Final Fantasy XVI is about, and kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to do a review of it on the channel, is that it does have some bookish inclinations in terms of being inspired by Game of Thrones, specifically Game of Thrones in terms of the TV version, which is based on the book series A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. And I've definitely read a good portion of the Song and Ice and Fire series, so I'm familiar with it in terms of things, but I still need to write proper reviews for each of the books in terms of the ones that have been released up till now. So I did plan originally to do a complete rereading of A Song on Ice and Fire and upload not only those reviews to the channel, but also writing them on my Goodreads and for my blog. But it keeps getting like pushed down the pipeline in terms of things. So I do want to do that project eventually and kind of talk about it in terms of things, but I know it'll be coming. But specifically to say about Final Fantasy XVI's link to Game of Thrones, you might be wondering, is this game actually similar to Game of Thrones? And considering that the staff had to watch the TV series in preparation in terms of the making of this game, it definitely had an impact on it. I would not say that it is exactly like Game of Thrones. There are definitely elements where it is very heavily inspired, but I would say that it tells its own respective epic story in a way that I was not expecting when I picked up this game. To speak of what this is about without going into too many spoilers for things, because even the demo has some hard-hitting plot points that would probably spoil some of the experience in terms of this. What I will tell you is that this game centers on the protagonist, who is named Clive Rosfield. And you follow Clive through a number of different events in terms of the prologue. You start off with this really grand opening in terms of like two entities called icons who are battling it out, and you don't know who they are. If you're a Final Fantasy fan, you can recognize the icons as Ifrit as well as the Phoenix. And you don't know necessarily like who these two icons are and why they're battling and that kind of thing, but the story eventually gets you into like who those icons are and why they're battling, and basically like goes through the prologue in terms of like leading up to those events. But you start off following Clive as a 28-year-old soldier with a mark on his face, and he's searching with his party members for the dominant Shiva, and that's basically like kind of like the setup for things here. A number of different events happen in terms of Clive, like, you know, seeing this epic battle play out, and then you're transported into the past to see 15-year-old Clive in terms of the relationship with his family and the dynamics that happen with that. And then ultimately, in terms of things, you also see Clive reckon with one of the biggest events of what shapes the game's events to follow, which is the fallout at Phoenix Gate. And that becomes the catalyst to what Clive, in terms of meeting the middle of both of 15-year-old Clive to 28-year-old Clive, as well as 33-year-old Clive, which is 5 years set after the events of when he's 28. So you go through three distinct time periods in Clive Rosfield's life to determine his journey and his arc throughout this game. It is a game that chronicles a lot of trauma, a lot of things that Clive has to reckon with in terms of things that he has done, meets a number of different colorful characters in the course of his journey, which is bent on revenge and trauma and trying to cope with that trauma. And I was very impressed with seeing this whole arc play out as I played the game. And from a story standpoint, I thought Clive's story was excellently told. It's hard not to like it's not even just the fact that Clive himself as a protagonist is likable, and it's easy to get to know him, as well as reckon with some of the things that happen to him in this game, but also the way that it tells the narrative in terms of the grand scale of the part he plays, and giving you pieces of information throughout the storyline in terms of how significant of a role he has in all of these different events, is so well done in terms of the pacing, as well as in terms of the emotional resonance that you get to see as you get to know Clive and his predicaments, and the role that he plays for within this game in terms of the people he meets, and also the larger pieces of what he chooses to do in terms of trying to do what he believes is right, but also reckoning with that past trauma and reckoning with his bid for revenge. So that is a very creative way of me kind of tap dancing around a lot of spoilers for Final Fantasy XVI. And what I want to focus this review on is kind of like looking at the overall picture of what this game chooses to do. Not even just like, even though Clive is the main character of the story, you get to know a lot of wonderfully well-written characters, well-acted characters. The voice acting cast of this was absolutely phenomenal in terms of the way that they portrayed each character. Even the NPCs, even the characters that are considered as a part of side quests and other pieces of the story, were very layered and detailed and very well done in terms of the scope of things. And something that I did like about Final Fantasy XVI was the fact that you have the main storyline and you have some of the side quests that you complete in terms of having Clive interact with the world around him, to get to know the characters in the conflict and things like that. But what I really liked about it was that you could see the impact of how some of these side quests, even as small of tasks as they seem to have, like delivering food to patrons and things like that, you see Clive's interactions with them in terms of building this world and the overarching conflict and how people are treated in this respective society in terms of Sam Breck and several other different locations, and Rosaria, and several different locations within this world. And Clive has to reckon with his previous roles, as well as his current state of things in the present day in terms of things. It's a lot. I like how the side missions, as well as the main narrative story, have their own different pieces to contribute to allow you to get to know the characters a little bit more, and as well as developing Clive's respective story as well. It reminded me a little bit in terms of the sequencing of The Witcher, if I were to compare it in terms of how The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt did its respective side missions. You're doing different tasks in terms of Clive interacting with the world and completing missions and things like that, but at least it gives you an opportunity to be able to get to know even more characters, and also get to know the world as you're completing them. So it's definitely something that I appreciated. I completed all the side quests. I completed the main story, and I finished it not very long ago, and I was just really impressed with how cohesive it turned out to be. I had my criticisms of Final Fantasy XV, even though I really enjoyed that game. I felt that the main campaign for Final Fantasy XV was a little bit disjointed, despite having strong characters and things like that, where some characters were done remarkably well in certain things. Others kind of seem to get shortchanged in terms of the main storyline because we didn't see them as much in terms of things. Whereas Final Fantasy XVI does this in a way that feels definitely more cohesive, definitely more invested and focused, and that is partially due to how not only you interacting in the main quest and the side quest and following Clive and seeing this respective story play out, but also the active time lore, which is a new feature to Final Fantasy in terms of being able to see different players and different locales and different histories that are associated with each of the events that you see throughout the game in such a cinematic role. It gives context to these in a way that fleshes out the series and makes it easier to understand in terms of who these characters are, what role they play in this respective world, and essentially summarizing things that even as you're consuming the story, you also have context that builds into this world in a way that's developed very well. So I was very impressed with the storytelling behind Final Fantasy XVI in an overarching way. Plot. Okay, so we're going to talk about plot for Final Fantasy XVI without trying to spoil the game, which feels like a task in and of itself in terms of trying to do it, because this game features a lot of plot, a lot of plot in terms of things that happened to Clive in his respective journey from the events of Phoenix Gate into his adulthood, how he's made to be a soldier on the front lines, what his quest for revenge is like, who he meets in the spectrum of that quest for revenge, how it changes over time to include a different focus, how he learns that he has a role to play in this respective conflict more than he thought that he had, and trying to restore peace and balance to the different kingdoms of things where magic is really shunned and there are different classes of people that are being persecuted because of their ability to use magic, or in terms of the world that's built around it. It's an interesting set of events to be able to see these different conflicts, this quest in terms of it's a combination of a personal quest for Clive in terms of what he chooses to do in the aftermath of Phoenix Gate, and it involves a bit of him reckoning with that trauma and reckoning with his role from it in those events in terms of things. Man, yeah, it's hard for me to talk about it without spoiling significant pieces of the story. I definitely want to talk about this more in my spoiler review of Final Fantasy XVI, but it's definitely a game that has a lot of moving pieces to it in terms of the lore, in terms of the overarching conflict, and in terms of the characters and their roles in this respective world. And I think this game did a wonderful job of making it cohesive and easier to follow and easier to be able to resonate with in terms of that balance between character development and story. Final Fantasy as a franchise has never been shy about showcasing themes of war and devastation and characters being manipulated and used, and quest for power and discrimination and things like that. And it's something that through each of the different titles that I have played through, I've always appreciated. I really just think that this is consistent in a long line of quality storytelling from the franchise, and if anything, I think that it adds on to that legacy in a way that is consistent with the franchise, if even it's among some of the better entries in terms of being able to showcase these themes in a way that is resonant, impactful, and stays with you. And I definitely found myself getting emotional in terms of some of the heavily hitting scenes in Final Fantasy XVI as they happen to Clive, as they happen to Sid, as they happen to Jill, as they happen to Gav, as they happen to even Torgal, who is the most adorable, best pup ever, and you can absolutely pet the dog. I actually loved being able to see the different range of characters and having emotional moments of where even between the heavier hitting pieces of the overarching plot, you have some of those lighter moments where you can see the characters interact and get to know them better. I liked being able to see that balance play out within the story in terms of things. So yeah, the plot line, absolutely well done. I think the only criticism I have of the plot specifically, like in terms of it, is probably some of the narrative pacing in terms of what happens between when Clive is 28 and 33. So there's a 5-year gap that happens closer to the latter part of the game after some pivotal events where the pacing was a little bit like shaky. I don't know if it should have been that long of a narrative gap between the events that happened when Clive was 28 and the events that happened when he was 33. But I think it was important to the narrative story in terms of being able to see how he grew from what role he played after the events that transpired in terms of the 5 years later, and how that changed in terms of what he wanted to do, basically going from this seat of vengeance to trying to navigate what his the mystery behind his identity and the corruption of the world around him in terms of things, magical corruption specifically in terms of what he sees in terms of things. And I'm not going to go into too many spoilers about that because that's something that I can probably talk more about in terms of the world building. That 5-year gap definitely felt like there could have been things that were more expounded upon in terms of the immediate aftermath of what led to that 5-year gap and how Clive's role changed, respectively, in terms of the story arc. I feel like that transition could have been a little bit better in terms of the pacing of the game, to put it simply. I'll talk more about that in my spoiler-heavy review of Final Fantasy XVI in terms of how that made me feel in terms of the overarching story. But if I'm taking all the different pieces with respect to the overarching plot of Final Fantasy 16, I'd still give it a solid 9 out of 10. Yeah, I think because of the way that it chose to tell its story and how resonant it was still very strong, even if it wasn't perfectly executed for certain pieces of the story. But I felt like it was just a full narrative experience, considering we get to learn about the characters, we get to learn about the world, we get to learn about Clive's respective journey, and it feels like a full journey arc for this respective hero. So I felt satisfied in playing Final Fantasy XVI for the solid plot, 9 out of 10. So characters, how do I talk about the characters in this game without going into massive spoilers? Because these characters go through quite a bit in this in terms of things. People ask me, like, like I've been asked by like a few people in terms of things like, is there a definitive red wedding scene in Final Fantasy 16? There's multiple red wedding scenes in Final Fantasy 16. Let's just say it like that, because there are definitely things where you are not expecting some of the events to happen when they happen, and they are emotionally impactful and very, very intense in terms of things. Sometimes, like, I knew I had to take a break from some of the more intense scenes in terms of what happens to these characters, because it does such a great job of getting you invested in terms of the collective cast of characters in Final Fantasy XVI. I did mention Clive Rosfield is the main character of Final Fantasy XVI, and I did mention also that his is really the story, like where the story revolves around, chiefly in terms of events, in terms of how you're following him. He's definitely in the line of one of my top three Final Fantasy main protagonists because of how complete and full his respective arc in the story was, in terms of from beginning to end. Even though you're not certain of Clive's character from the very moment that you start meeting him in the story. He's known as Wyvern in the prologue, in terms of things of when you meet him. When you actually get to start knowing Clive in terms of who he is, what role he plays in this respective tale, and how his quest for vengeance plays out in the resulting effects, and what he learns and discovers from that, it's just incredibly satisfying to watch as a storyteller, as someone who loves emotionally intense stories. It's a narrative art that I really appreciate being able to see and play through in the eyes of Clive. And I really just like his personality. He has kind of like, he goes from moments of being, total badass in terms of being able to wield his sword and do what he can as a soldier, in the mix of all these different events and discoveries, while also in terms of the way that he interacts with other characters. You can tell he has a genuine sense of caring for the people that he meets. And you even learn this even in the prologue when he's 15, in terms of being like one of the a part of the royal family of Rosaria, and the role that he plays in terms of the interactions that he has with different people. And then when things transpire in terms of leading you up to the moments where he's older and going through specific events, even his interactions with doing different missions and interacting with different people, you can tell it's easy to follow and easy to really be able to empathize with Clive as he's going through this respective journey. Very, very quick update video. I realized that I actually forgot to mention in terms of the character. Well, I didn't actually forget to mention this character, but I wanted to clarify. There is a reason why I'm avoiding talking about Joshua in this video, because if I start talking about Joshua, I will be tempted to spoil the experience of this game in terms of his role. But there is a very pivotal reason in terms of the role that Joshua plays as Clive's little brother, who is the Phoenix, who is the designated dominant, and has a role of playing or being the next future king of the this respective world in terms of Rosaria. That definitely has an impact on the story. So I will talk more about Joshua's role and character and the relationship between him and Clive in the spoilery video. I have not forgotten about him. I just did not want to be tempted to spoil the experience that is Final Fantasy XVI by talking more in depth. But Joshua is a wonderful character, and I actually enjoyed and appreciate his role in the respective series in terms of the way that the storytellers chose to do it in terms of things. And you'll learn more about that if you watch my spoiler review in terms of my thoughts of how his role comes to be and the role that he plays in the game. Some other really standout characters for Final Fantasy XVI include Cid. Definitely 10 out of 10 Cid for me. I would say, in my opinion, this is the best Cid from the Final Fantasy franchise, for me at least. I've played multiple Final Fantasies, and if you're a Final Fantasy fan, you know that Sid is a character that has shown up in multiple Final Fantasies with respect to different roles and different things, and usually there's kind of like a link to airships and things like that. Even Sid Highwind from Final Fantasy VII is a very popular Sid as well in terms of things, but I would say that Sidolphus in Final Fantasy XVI is definitely one of my favorite Sids. Just his very cheeky and very blunt sense of humor, and I think the voice actor said this very brilliantly in terms of the way that his interactions with Clive are basically taking the piss in terms of things. And I'll put a clip here for your reference.
As a lot of men do, sometimes toxically, but they take the piss out of each other, and they push each other on and encourage each other by insulting each other and doing each other down, and that's a very specifically male thing, which can be very toxic, but can also be something very beautiful.
You all right? Never better.
Sounds like it. And I think that's the thing with Clive and Sid. I mean, they love each other very much. Sid absolutely loves and worships Clive and wants to help him fulfill his destiny. But to get him to do that, occasionally he's got to take the piss out of him and tell him he's a little bit of an idiot and get your head out your ass and get on with it.
But in terms of why he says that and how he says that, but that kind of camaraderie that you see between Clive and Sid really makes a lot of the game's moments hit that much harder, and you get to know these characters so well. Another character that I could say really stands out is Jill. And to tell you in terms of things, I think Jill had a very strong narrative arc in Final Fantasy XVI in a way that I think one of the things about Final Fantasy XV that I was a little disappointed by was the narrative arc that was done for Luna Freya, which I think she deserved a lot better in terms of things. There have been a history of very strong female characters in Final Fantasy in terms of things. I think Yuna from Final Fantasy X is definitely one of the strongest. I think Terra from my absolute favorite Final Fantasy game, Final Fantasy VI Stateside, is one of my favorite Final Fantasy games, and Terra's respective story is actually one of my favorites, so I definitely name her as another strong character as well. But to speak of Jill, I think the way that this game does her narrative arc is wonderfully done, because she has a shared history with Clive in terms of them being childhood friends, even amounting to something more in terms of the experiences that they go through. And the way that this game does with respect to introducing Jill's arc, having it as a parallel to Clive's in terms of the trauma that they respectively go through, and in this world, and are in terms of having the shared momentum in terms of what they're fighting for. I think it did a great job of giving her both agency as well as a role in this respective story that does very well standing on its own, as well as respectively tying with Clive's journey throughout Final Fantasy XVI. So I'll definitely say that I appreciated Jill's journey and Jill's story arc in this game. Another one, in terms of minor characters for things, I definitely love Gav. I absolutely loved Gav in terms of his role in Final Fantasy XVI as well. He was one of my favorite members of the Hideaway as well. And I think if you know of the events of Final Fantasy XVI in terms of the role that he plays, as well as essentially like some of the comic relief that he provides, not even like sometimes there are genuine like emotionally resonant moments that he goes through that are both traumatizing and also things that he has to cope with and deal with in the spectrum of the story. But the way that the game develops Gav in terms of his roles as well was very well done, and I followed his character very, very well as well. It's hard to choose favorite characters in this game because you see so many different layers, and like even like the non playable characters for with respect to the side missions and things like that, you get a chance to be able to get to know these characters in the scheme of events in terms of these different kingdoms being clashing, and the central conflict of things in Final Fantasy XVI that give it a way of resonating with you. And I enjoyed being able to see all of them in terms of things, even though it is very much like Game of Thrones in terms of things where like your favorite may die. I will say that right now in terms of things. Don't go into this thinking that everybody's going to make it out well in terms of things, because it's a heavy story. It's a emotionally impactful story, and as I mentioned before, in terms of things, there are multiple red wedding type scenes in Final Fantasy 16, and when it hits hard, it hits hard. Even the villains of Final Fantasy 16 are very well developed. Just being able to see the character art of Benedicta, Annabelle is absolutely evil. A lot of people can definitely see the parallels to Cersei from Game of Thrones with her. And I'm not going to spoil it in terms of things, but yeah, she's definitely a character to watch here in terms of things. Kupka, definitely well done villain in many different respects here. Barnabas, definitely well done villain in many aspects here in terms of the levels of why he's inspired to do what he does in the spectrum of this game. And Barnabas as a villain, boy, that's I'll probably talk about more about him in terms of the events of Final Fantasy 16 in my spoiler review, but yeah, he was definitely a villain. Definitely a villain. And then we also have Ultima, which, even looking at Ultima in terms of things, it's just like the opening scene when Ultima, or the scene where Ultima shows up for the first time, is one that kind of will stay with you in terms of things. It definitely stayed with me in terms of the overarching scenes, definitive scenes that transpired during this game. So I definitely would see, like, in a Dissidia type thing, if characters were represented in that respective thing, definitely Clive would have a place in it as an ally. Sid would have a place in it as an ally, and then probably if there were villains to be said about it, probably Ultima and Barnabas in terms of, and I'm not going to go into too many spoilers in terms of why I make those choices, but definitely like characters to watch for in this respective game. Music. Can we talk about the music for this game? My gosh, I've been a long time fan of the Final Fantasy franchise in terms of the orchestration that has been done with each game in terms of the main lines of stories. And I've played a number of them. I'll go into a later detail in terms of which specific titles that I've played, but I will definitely say that Final Fantasy 16 has one of my favorite overarching soundtracks in the franchise to date. I was very impressed with how music is showcased in this respective game, for the emotional resonance for each scene that you're battling with the icon battles. Very epic, very orchestral focus in terms of you feel that these battles and these conflicts are significant from how emotionally resonant the music is in context with each scene. And even in some of the quieter moments when you're trekking through specific locations and things like that, it's just a wonderful sense of ambiance and immersion that this game includes within it through the progression from beginning to end. And I noticed this when I started making the clips for this respective video. The soundtrack for Final Fantasy XVI was released this past Wednesday, which I believe would have been July 19th, digitally on iTunes, and it was the #1 album for I think a few days in terms of things. And I think that is a testament in terms of saying how many people were anticipating the soundtrack and really enjoyed it, and I count myself as one of them. I definitely would give the music in this respective game 10 out of 10. It just really, even listening to it being removed from the game itself, I did buy the soundtrack from iTunes. I have been enjoying every single track that I have listened to since I started listening to it. And I think one of my favorite tracks is definitely Land of Icons, which is the opening screen theme for when you open the game that is playing on the title screen. Another one is Sid's specific theme, which I believe is also the theme of the Hideaway. It's called Hideaway. That was one of my favorite tracks in the game as well. I have so many that I could name. I could probably film a video review of the Final Fantasy 16 soundtrack in and of itself, but to keep it brief, 10 out of 10. Loved the music in this game. Would definitely recommend buying the soundtrack. It's just done so well. And I know that there have been people who have said, well, some of the music, like, it's a combination of callbacks to previous Final Fantasies while also very distinctly establishing itself with respect to this specific title as well, in terms of the way that it does its battles, the way that it does its ambiance for the specific scenes in this. It's a mix of classic, a mix of modern, and it definitely works well in context for the game as you're playing through certain scenes and seeing different things transpire throughout the game for the emotional resonance that it has. I enjoyed it. I definitely enjoyed it. So I'm going to talk about the gameplay itself. The gameplay for a lot of people who are familiar with Final Fantasy may be very different from what they're used to. So to kind of speak on this, a lot of formative experiences for Final Fantasy fans and even fans of JRPGs is that a lot of the previous games are turn-based RPGs. So in terms of turn-based role-playing games are, you have the system where like you have kind of like this this menu-based system where you're choosing actions for your characters to take in terms of the battles that they're doing. Like you can use an attack, you can use magic, you can use an item to heal yourself. You can use or cure like a bad condition or things like that, or choice of defending. So there's the gameplay of that is very different than what an action game would be. And for a lot of Final Fantasy fans, in terms of things, 16 is going to be closer to what the experience of combat was for Final Fantasy VII Remake without the distinct menu system, because this particular entry in the Final Fantasy series is more action based. So basically you have certain actions that are tied to specific buttons that you press or combinations or things like that. So a lot of the gameplay is more similar to a title like Devil May Cry 5 rather than some of the other previous entries of Final Fantasy where you have that turn-based RPG type playthrough. And I've heard various criticisms of it in terms of it being a kind of like stark departure from that traditional style of combat to a more action-heavy thing. But I had no problems with it at all. Absolutely not. And it makes sense that, and I compare it to Devil May Cry 5 because there is a significant part of the team that did work on Devil May Cry 5 who were part of the Final Fantasy 16 design of the game and the combat style that is implemented in the game. I actually enjoyed it. I enjoyed it for the flexibility it gives the player in terms of the combinations of things that you are allowed to do with it. You can be equipped with certain items in terms of things that give you aids in battle that allow you to customize the type of play style that you are you want to play Final Fantasy 16 with. There's no set recipe and no right way to do it, but there's certain aids that you can have in battle in terms of things. You have a ring that gives you control of that lets Toril act on his own in terms of things instead of having to control him with one part of the controller for things, because like you have party members that act in the background, but Toril is an assistant to Clive like in battle in terms of things, and you can command him to do certain things to help Clive in battle, as well as control Clive in battle in terms of whether he defends, whether he attacks and things like that. And it's interesting to see how dynamic this battle system is in terms of things. And I could adjust to it pretty well because I'm used to playing different types of games. But I do like that traditional turn-based RPG that I see in a lot of JRPGs and things like that, because there is a certain element to it that I've been playing for quite some time, especially within the realm of Final Fantasy. But I think the best adaptation of this mix of turn-based style and action thing is still Final Fantasy VII Remake, because they did a wonderful job of doing the combination of action buttons in terms of things where you can execute magic spells and attacks and things like that, but also at the same time giving you time to be able to choose this dynamic in terms of things and making you feel like you're in the spectrum of the battle in terms of things. Final Fantasy 16 it goes a little bit further than Remake in terms of being more action heavy and things like that, but it does so in a way that you still have customizability to play it how you want to play it in terms of things based on what you're comfortable doing. You can have even another example of the gameplay in terms of things where it rewards you in terms of being active. You can either execute attacks and defenses in terms of having a counter attack that follows up after you defend, and Clive is able to do a stagger effect on the enemies that he's fighting, which in turn helps wear down the battles, even some of the very harder battles that definitely come up during this game. But I feel like even if you are not great at defending in terms of things, you can also equip a ring that allows you to auto defend and execute those things and adapt it to the style of play that you choose to do. So there are multiple rings, multiple effects in terms of like customization that you can put with certain attacks on this, which make it easy to kind of like pick and choose on what works best for you as you're playing. So I had no complaints. I had no complaints with the battle system at all in terms of being able to learn it and adapt to it in terms of things. Do I miss the turn-based style combat? Kinda. But at the same time, with this being as unique as it was in terms of a Final Fantasy entry, in terms of things, I actually did enjoy the combat system for this. I would give it 9 out of 10. 9 out of 10 I think seems fair in terms of things, because I had no trouble with learning it. I had no trouble with adapting to certain elements of it. And it felt very, very satisfying to play in terms of some of the bigger and more grandiose battles in terms of things, especially with a very hard boss that you have to beat in terms of things. One other thing that I'll mention about the battle system and the gameplay aspect is that there are action time buttons in terms of things, like in terms of the sequence of the battle system here. So when you're fighting like an icon in terms of things, you have cinematic moments that prompt you to do some button mashing if you need to in terms of things that can turn the tide of battle in terms of things. And it does feel satisfying to be able to see that cinematic a clash between like very powerful characters and then pivotal emotional moments in the series. I'll also say, like, in terms of the gameplay mechanics, like why I give it a 9 out of 10 instead of a 10 out of 10. And this is a critique of it. Some of the icon battles felt a little bit long in terms of the pacing for me. So that was something that kind of, it didn't ruin my impression of the game. It may for other people, like in terms of when they're playing, like in the dynamic of things, and like I'm trying to get to that point where they get to the next narrative step in the story. Some of the icon battles, it can be long. I've played long battles before, so I'm used to it in terms of things. I played RPGs, tactical RPG battles, where the battle may have taken me 2 hours to beat. I've played Octopath Traveler. Let me say it like that. I played Octopath Traveler, and I am used to playing long, epic boss battles in terms of things where it takes me a while to get there. But I think with respect to some of the icon battles, in terms of the pacing for certain things, especially with how grandiose as those battles are, some of them don't really give you that kind of break to be able to like digest events and things like that. So it could have been shortened a little bit, but they still felt satisfying for me to play through and actually watch unfold and things like that. And then when I finally finished the battle, I'm like, ah. But yeah, I would definitely give the gameplay aspect of Final Fantasy XVI 9 out of 10. Graphics with respect to Final Fantasy XVI are definitely next gen level. I can definitely tell the graphical improvements in terms of things, and it's probably because this is technically the first game that I've played on a PS5 in terms of things. It absolutely looks gorgeous to be able to see play out as you're exploring the different worlds and things. One critique that I had was with the motion blur aspect that was featured in terms of the menus, and that was another point that other people had issues with because of it making them kind of slightly motion sick and stuff like that. But the developers were on top of that and actually implemented a sliding adjustment in terms of things for a setting where you can adjust the motion blur. So that I definitely welcomed that, and I thought that was a great addition in terms of things. So I'm glad that they listened to that. As far as the graphics are concerned, in terms of the creation of the worlds and things like that, every setting was absolutely beautiful. Absolutely, like, immersed me like in each of the different environments, even going through like several of the different forest environments, to the desert, to the different realms in terms of things that even happened after Phoenix Gate, and seeing what's happening to the world around Clive as a result of the effects of certain things that are very plot related and very spoiler heavy that I'm not going to get into in this video, but you can tell the impact of the environment and see the level of immersion in each of these different locations. You can see the impact of a very war-torn, conflict-heavy environment in Final Fantasy XVI in terms of things that it does not let up in terms of some of the brutality that you see. So a lot of people were asking me, like, do you like, is this like, you know, like really a graphic heavy like game? I'm like, yeah, you definitely see a lot of blood. It's a mature Final Fantasy game, and I think this is the second title of the Final Fantasy franchise that actually may be rated M for mature, because I think the very first Final Fantasy that I played that was rated M for mature was Final Fantasy Type 0, which I played a number of years ago. I liked it. It's definitely heavy, and it's definitely in a league of heaviness as to that in terms of showcasing the horrors of war. Is it more intense than Type 0? I would say yeah, at the level, if not beyond, in terms of things. and you see a lot of the impact that has with respect to the characters in this tale. And yeah, I say like it definitely like gets its narrative cues from Game of Thrones as well. As far as my game completion time is concerned for Final Fantasy 16, it took me about 79 hours to complete. So I'll say that it was a fairly big size game. Depending on how well of a gamer you are, you can complete it in as early probably as like 60 some hours. I took my time with it in terms of like when I ended up picking up the game and when I ended up completing it, like playing it like several hours, like, you know, in terms of um, from the time that it released up to the point that I completed it several days ago. But it's a fairly a big size game, and you can take your, and I think it improves with how you take your time with it in terms of things. If you try to grind it a little bit, it's in terms of things, it maybe certain elements of it may feel a little bit overwhelming, particularly with some of the heavier hitting plot points. So I would say definitely take your time with this one. It's not a game where I think you need to grind levels specifically, like in terms of being able to level up Clive for his experience and things like that. I have not played the Final Fantasy mode quite yet, but I do plan on doing so, and also trying to see if I can platinum trophy the game on PS5. I will let you know as soon as I decide to undertake that challenge. But I told myself I needed a break because there was a lot of very heavy hitting stuff in this game, and I told myself I know there's definitely some new content within the Final Fantasy mode that is not available in the normal mode for Final Fantasy 16, and I do know that there have been teasings of whether or not there will be DLC coming for this respective game. But I do plan on trying to see if I can complete the game in Final Fantasy mode and on Platinum Trophy when I get the opportunity to. I just need to take a break to be able to psych myself up to be able to undertake that task. So you may be wondering what my overarching score of Final Fantasy 16 would be, considering all the different elements: story, characters, story, plot, characters, gameplay, graphics, the whole experience in terms of things. I think I feel pretty comfortable giving this being a 9 out of 10 game. I don't like it's definitely like an experience that I would recommend in terms of things, and it felt very satisfying to play. I definitely connected with the story and the overarching characters and the overarching experience that it provided in terms of things. Is it my favorite Final Fantasy? It's in my top 5 titles, I will say that, in terms of things, without going into too many spoilers or other discussions in terms of the other Final Fantasy games that I played, and I've played many, like almost all of them. I think there are two that I missed in terms of things because I don't play MMORPGs. I've not played Final Fantasy 11 or 14, unfortunately. My main I did try Final Fantasy 14 in terms of the experience, but it just didn't work out for me like the way that I want to. But I am willing to kind of try again with it. I'm trying to think of other titles that I have not played for this. I have not played Final Fantasy II, I think, is one, the Furion story, if I remember correctly, in terms of things. I know that there are Final Fantasies that I actually played later on in life that I did not have a chance to play when I was a kid, and so I've just been kind of trying to catch up with the experience in terms of things, just because I had not had the opportunity to play them. But I can talk about that in another video. But as far as comparatively speaking, it is definitely one of the stronger entries in the Final Fantasy franchise for me. And considering how many Easter egg references this game has in terms of other Final Fantasy titles, in terms of things. There's a lot to get out of this game. There's a lot to get out of this game, and I really, really enjoyed the experience. And I'm happy to end the video here with my final thoughts on Final Fantasy XVI. So, non-spoiler review done. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and hit the notification bell to be informed of when I post new videos. Thank you again for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next video.